Have you ever walked down a small western street, quiet as a churchyard, only to have that stillness shattered by the crack of a whip on dry earth, loud and sharp as thunder rolling across the desert? It's the kind of sound that ties a knot in your chest and forces a question if the one tied to the post were a young girl, thin and starving. Her eyes darting for the last scrap of hope. Would you step forward? Or would you lower your head and hurry by? Before I tell you this story, one heavy with gunpowder, dust, and justice, don't forget to press that like button to keep these stories alive. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your words are the campfire that keeps these tales burning. I promise, if you stay with me until the end, you'll see not just how fear and despair can grind a soul to pieces, but how a single moment can turn two lives onto a road they never expected. It was late afternoon in Silver Briar, a small town tucked under the Red Rock Ridge. The wind pushed grit down the main street, making the crooked sign above Halper and Company, Mercantile Creek. An old dog dozed under the smithy's porch, twitching its tail in sleep. A coal wagon groaned to a stop by the hitch rail. At first glance, it was the same quiet end to another day. But in front of the post office, quiet had been broken to splinters. A crowd had gathered, faces lit not with kindness, but with the gleam of people hungry for spectacle. At the center, her thin wrists stretched high above her head, Iyana Greybird hung bound to a rough timber crossbar. Her hair was tangled, her cheek raw where she'd been dragged across the dirt. Her deerskin dress was torn, one narrow shoulder bare to the wind. Her crime a single loaf of bread. They said she had slipped it under her dress inside Halper's store. The shopkeeper shouted loud enough to bring half the town running. No one asked why a half-Apache girl would risk such a thing. No one cared how long she'd gone without food. To them, she was a thief, and the town needed an example. Now, as the sun slid toward the ridge, that example took shape. Roof Malloy, broad-shouldered and cruel-eyed, held a long bullwhip. He lashed it once into the dust, the crack splitting the air, drawing a sick thrill from the onlookers. Each step he took closer made Iyana's stomach twist. She clenched her jaw to keep from crying out, because she knew one tear would only feed their scorn. Her gaze dropped to the dirt, bracing for the first strike. A woman tugged her boy back, muttering that he ought to learn a lesson. An old smith coughed, but said nothing. The crowd held its breath, waiting. Iyana shut her eyes. Inside, every nerve screamed. Hunger. Shame. The sting of rope on her wrists, it all pressed on her at once. She thought of the forests far away, of her mother's singing, now only a ghost of memory. And she knew, in this town, none of that mattered. Malloy smiled thinly and raised the whip high. The crowd went still. The air froze. And just as the leather was about to fall, a voice cut across the street low. Steady. Final untie her. It wasn't shouted, but it carried, heavy as iron, bouncing off every wall of Silver Briar. The crowd turned. From the shadow between the saloon and the livery stepped a tall figure, trail coat gray with dust, hat brim low. A Henry rifle hung easy in his hand, the kind of easy that said it could rise in a heartbeat. His name was Beckett Lane. No one knew him. He wasn't from Silver Briar. But in 3 words, he froze Malloy in his tracks. The whip hovered in the air, then stilled. The crowd rippled with unease. Iyana opened her eyes. She saw broad shoulders, a calm, hard gaze, and the kind of presence that made men hesitate. No comfort, no pity in his face, just a line drawn in the dirt that no one dared cross. And in that instant, the despair ready to swallow her whole was checked. Hope, thin as a breath, slipped in where there had been none. This story begins in that moment when a drifter chose not to turn away, when the whip was halted by that iron voice. All of Silver Briar froze. Beckett Lane strode through the crowd, cutting the rope from Iyana's wrists. Her arms dropped limp, trembling after hours stretched high above her head. She staggered, nearly collapsing, until a rough but steady hand caught her elbow and held her upright. Without a single wasted word, Beckett shrugged off his trail-worn coat and settled it over her shoulders, wrapping the heavy fabric around her like a shield against every prying eye. He never looked back. He only gave the faintest nod, set a guiding hand at her back, and walked her straight through the silent crowd. Not even Ruth Malloy dared speak. Each step on the dusty street rang in Iyana's ears like a drumbeat of deliverance. Beyond the last building, under a stand of cottonwoods, his horse waited. Beckett lifted her carefully into the saddle, mounted behind her, and rode out of town. The cold wind stung her face, but instead of shame at the post, she felt the warm weight of his coat, the smell of leather and smoke, and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them. For the first time in days, her chest loosened. By dusk they reached a small log cabin tucked beside a stream. Smoke curled faint from its chimney, carrying a sense of safety. Beckett tied the horse, then came around to lift her down. Her knees wobbled, but this ground felt softer, free of wooden posts and the stares of a crowd. The cabin was small, one room with a hearth, a rough-hewn table, and a bunk against the wall. Yet to Iyana, it felt like a sanctuary. Beckett stoked the fire higher, set beans and a scrap of meat to heat, and poured her a tin cup of water. No questions, no speeches, just a plate slid across the table. The scent of food made her stomach clench. Her thin fingers shook as she took the spoon, bringing each bite slowly to her lips. Tears stung her eyes, not from pain this time, but from the simple relief of being fed. Beckett stood near the hearth, face turned toward the fire, not pressing her with words. That silence without blame, without pity, let her finish every bite. When she laid the spoon down, only one hoarse whisper escaped her throat. "Thank you." He spread a blanket close to the fire. "Sleep there," he said, his voice low, not unkind. Iyana curled herself in his coat, sinking onto the rough blanket, on the other side of the room. Beckett sat on his bunk, cleaning his revolver in the lamplight. The flames hissed and cracked. For the first time in months, she closed her eyes without the image of rope and ridicule. Instead, she saw the man who had stood against the whip, coat still on his shoulders. That image let her drift into sleep. At dawn, Beckett woke to silence. The blanket by the hearth was empty. So was his coat. He looked around the cabin, unmoving, then sighed. People never stayed, he knew that. They always left by first light. He ate cold beans, saddled his horse, but before he could mount, movement caught his eye by the fence. She was there, Iyana Greybird, hair loose around her face, the coat still on her shoulders. She stood straighter than last night, though weariness still pulled at her. Her voice was quiet, almost braced for rejection. "I came back." Beckett studied her a long moment, jaw tight. He asked no questions. Finally, with a small tilt of his head toward the woodpile, he said, "If you're staying, we need firewood." A faint light rose in her eyes, not the look of someone spared, but of someone allowed to belong. She moved to the pile, carrying logs one by one to the door. Her steps were slow, careful, as if each piece of wood were proof she was worth the space she had taken the night before. Inside, the cabin breathed warmer. Beckett stripped the saddle from the horse. Iyana fetched water from the stream. Later, when they sat down to a meager breakfast, the silence was no longer heavy. No whip cracked in the dirt. No jeering faces pressed close. Only the pale morning light through the window and the soft warmth of a fire. Hope, fragile but real, had taken root. And both of them, each in their own way, felt that what had begun was not merely escape from fear, but the opening of something greater, Morning light streamed through the small cabin window, cutting a long stripe across the packed dirt floor. Iyana had been awake for hours. She stood quietly near the doorway, sweeping dust from the wooden frame with slow, deliberate strokes. Each movement was clumsy, yet it carried the determination of someone desperate to prove she was more than a burden. Beckett sat at the table, sipping weak coffee from a tin cup, his eyes following her without a word. He knew this girl was testing her place in the narrow world he'd built. By the hearth lay an old shirt of his, spread across her lap. She threaded a needle with careful fingers, mending the collar with patient stitches. Every time the needle slipped through the cloth, the firelight caught her face, showing the wary focus there. Beckett looked once, then turned away. He had lived alone too long to be used to the sight of a woman sewing in his cabin. But something in that simple image unsettled his solitude, warming it in a way he hadn't expected. Then he noticed her falter. She shifted her weight, trying to hide her left foot. Beckett caught it instantly, the way her brows pinched tight, her steps uneven. He set the cup down and rose. "Let me see," he said, voice low, certain. Iyana drew back, clutching his coat tighter around her. For a heartbeat, she feared what closeness might mean. But Beckett's eyes steady, distant, yet not cruel, made her nod. He knelt, gently sliding her foot free of the worn cloth. A raw scrape marred her ankle, rope burn still angry and fresh. Beckett poured whiskey on a clean rag, pressing it to the wound. She sucked in a sharp breath, eyes squeezed shut. His grip was firm, but never harsh, just the practiced hands of a man who had patched his own wounds too many times before. When the bandage was tied, snug, he looked up and said simply, "It'll hold." Silence followed. The only sound was the crackle of firewood. Iyana drew her foot back, holding the coat close. In her eyes flickered embarrassment, yet the silence between them no longer felt hostile. It was the hush of two guarded souls circling closer. Later, she carried water from the stream, half spilled before she reached the door, and she froze, whispering an apology with her eyes. Beckett didn't scold. He handed her a cloth to wipe the floor and took the bucket from her hands without comment. That night, as he sat cleaning his revolver, she bent again to the mending. Her hands trembled whenever he passed too close, yet her stitches held steady under the lamplight. Once, when she leaned too far, her tattered dress gaped at the collar. Beckett turned his face away, jaw tight. He would not let her think his gaze carried demand. Rising, he fetched his own spool of thread and needle. "Give it here. I'll stitch it," he said. She froze, clutching the fabric tight. Fear flickered in her chest, but when she saw the thread in his hand, she let out a breath and slowly passed the dress over, her palm shaking. Beckett crouched near the fire, his large hand surprisingly steady as he sewed the torn seam. When he finished, he handed it back. Their fingers brushed only an instant, yet it made her heart pound. He rose abruptly and stepped outside, splitting wood until the sun dropped, as though to scatter the weight of the moment. That night the cabin held more warmth than usual. Iyana lay wrapped in a blanket, listening to the fire whisper and crack. Beckett sat at the table, no longer watching her with suspicion, but with the quiet patience of a man keeping guard, between wariness and awkward silence. A fragile thread of trust had begun to form, thin as smoke, but strong enough to suggest she might not be turned away. The morning was cold, a thin mist hanging over the grass around the cabin. Iyana wrapped Beckett's coat tight around her waist so it wouldn't slip from her shoulders. She carried a small wooden pail to the stream, filling it with water, her breath showing white in the chill. Beckett had already saddled the horse, an empty sack tied to the side. Supplies were running low, whether he liked it or not. They had to ride back into Silver Briar. Iyana froze when he said, "We're going into town today." Fear flickered in her eyes, the memory of the post still raw. But Beckett looked squarely at her, voice steady and calm. "You're going with me." Those 4 words were like a shield, turning back the scorn and whispers waiting for them in Silver Briar. She nodded faintly. The road stretched long, but the horse's steady gait and Beckett's unshakable posture kept her breathing easier. The air carried the scent of dry leaves. When the first rooftops of Silver Briar showed beyond the cottonwoods, she drew a deep breath. This time, she promised herself, she would not run. The main street bustled more than it had on the day of the whipping. A cart of potatoes rattled past. An old woman tugged a mule across the way. Children ran ahead of the blacksmith's shop. Yet when Beckett and Iyana rode in, the air shifted, voices dropped, eyes turned. A murmur rippled. "That's the thief girl. Why's he bringing her back?" Beckett acted as if he heard none of it. He tied the horse in front of Halper and company, mercantile, then helped Iyana down. That small gesture so ordinary warmed her more than the coat around her shoulders. With his hand steady at her back, he guided her through the door. Inside, the smell of old wood and roasted coffee hung in the air. Halper, the shopkeeper, stiffened when his eyes fell on her. His mustache twitched as he barked. "You've got nerve, Beckett Lane. Bringing a thief back into my store." Beckett's gaze was flat, his tone iron. "She's with me." No hesitation, no explanations. The words hit like a hammer, silencing the room. A woman pulled her daughter aside. Halper's jaw worked, but instead of arguing, he turned and fetched flour, coffee, salt, and jerky. Beckett laid coin on the counter, counted out plain and fair. Through it all, Iyana stood close, clutching the coat. She heard the whispers around her. But more than that, she felt Beckett's hand steady on her arm. For the first time, she dared lift her head. Her eyes brushed against those of women by the door, hard stares. Yes, but tinged now with something else, hesitation. When Beckett finished, he tipped his head toward the door. "Let's go." Her steps wavered, but they did not falter. She left the mercantile upright, no rope, no whip cracking at her back. The sun caught them as they stepped outside. Beckett loaded the supplies onto the horse, slow and deliberate, unhurried under the weight of the town's stairs. For Iyana, that quiet defiance lit a fire inside. On the ride back, her voice was hushed. "Why do you do this? They hate me." Beckett adjusted the brim of his hat, eyes on the trail. "Let 'em. You're with me." Those same 4 words again. They sank into her chest, warming her deeper than the coat could. She pulled it tighter, not from fear this time, but to hold that warmth close. By the time the cabin came into view, the tension in her shoulders had eased. Beckett carried the sack inside, setting flour on the table, while she tended the fire and set a pot to boil. Nothing grand was spoken, but each small motion carried a new rhythm, an unspoken agreement that this place was no longer his alone. That night, while Beckett cleaned his rifle and she mended another shirt, both knew the truth. The trip to Silver Briar had not just been for coffee and salt. It was a declaration. She was no longer the girl tied to a post, and he was no longer a man who walked alone. They had faced the town together and returned together. In the quiet glow of the cabin, trust fragile but real settled between them, and with it came a warmth that made the fire burn brighter than it had in years. The valley morning seemed calmer than ever. Mist lingered low, the sun creeping over the ridge, painting the pines gold. Iyana sat by the cabin door, stacking the wood Beckett had split. Each strike of his axe rang out steady, strong, and for a moment it gave her the comfort of safety. Yet beneath the quiet lay a tension, like a wire pulled too tight. That noon, while Beckett was checking the fence along the tree line, The sound of hoofbeats rolled through the valley. They were heavy, hard, not the easy trot of a passing traveler. Iyana froze, hurried inside, clutching the cabin door. Her heart thudded hard in her chest. 3 riders appeared. At their head was Roof Malloy, the bullwhip still coiled in his hand, his crooked grin colder than the wind. He reined in at the fence and called out, "Lane, think you can hide her here. That girl belongs to this town." Beckett rode back from the trees. Tall in the saddle, Henry rifle across his thigh. His face was stone. His voice carried, low and even. "She doesn't belong to you." Malloy spat in the dirt. The men with him tightened their reins. But when Beckett raised the rifle into line, hesitation flickered. Silence held, sharp as a blade. Finally, Malloy growled, "This ain't finished." He yanked his reins, wheeling his horse. The 3 of them rode off in a storm of dust. From the cabin window, Iyana's knuckles whitened on the edge of Beckett's coat. She saw him lead his horse back, calm as stone, but fear burned in her chest. Malloy's hatred had not ended at threats, she knew that. 2 days later, the fear returned in flesh. Late afternoon, while Beckett fixed a hinge on the door, hoofbeats came again down the valley trail. This time it was not Malloy, but a man in a leather vest with a tin star shining on his chest. Deputy Ward Ellison, Sheriff Amos Kincaid's right hand. He stopped before the cabin, voice clipped with authority. "Beckett Lane, the sheriff gives orders. That Apache girl comes back to town to face judgment. Refuse, and you're standing against the law of Silver Briar." Iyana heard every word, her stomach twisting tight. She stepped back, shoulders trembling, the post and the whip flashing again in her mind. "They'll take me," she whispered. Beckett's hand came to her shoulder. Steady. His eyes never left Ellison. "Not while you're under this roof." His voice was quiet, but iron. He stepped onto the porch, rifle loose but ready. "If Sheriff Kincaid wants her, let him ride out here himself. I won't hand her to anyone else." Deputy Ellison's jaw tightened. The silence stretched, heavy and sharp. At last he sniffed, tugging his reins. "I'll deliver your words, but the sheriff's patience runs short. Lane." He turned his horse and rode off, dust swirling behind. Beckett watched until they disappeared, then came back inside. Iyana stood near the hearth, eyes wet, voice breaking. "You'll be killed for me." Beckett laid the rifle on the table, set his hat aside, and answered softly, "Like a vow, I've been dead once already. Not again." The cabin hushed, the only sound the pop of firewood. Outside, the wind stirred the pines with an uneasy moan. Iyana crouched to feed the fire, her hands shaking as she laid on more wood, as if holding on to the one warmth left. In the glow, she looked at Beckett and saw what she had never dared believe before a man willing to stand for her, even with a whole town against them. Fear still lingered, dark as storm clouds pressing close. But inside, the fragile root of trust held fast. Each spark from the fire seemed to whisper the same promise that when the dark came knocking, there would be someone standing in its way. The north wind swept down into the valley the night before, carrying the bite of snow. By morning, white flakes fell thick and fast, cloaking the cabin roof and the steps outside. Iyana pulled Beckett's coat tight across her shoulders and stood by the window. The world beyond was swallowed in white silence. Inside, only the fire's hiss and crack gave life. Fear of Malloy and Deputy Ellison lingered in her chest. But at least in this storm, no one would be riding out to trouble them. Beckett carried in the last armful of wood, snow covering his hat and shoulders. He dropped it by the hearth, brushed the frost from his hair, and sat down slow, as though steadying the whole room. "This storm will last," he said, voice low and sure. "We just keep the fire going." Iyana nodded. She fed the flames, set beans in the pot, and dropped in a few slices of dried meat. Steam curled upward, filling the cabin with warmth. Beckett sat at the table, honing his knife, while she worked opposite him, patching one of his worn shirts. Every so often, her eyes flicked toward him. Each time they met his, her chest tightened, part shyness, part gratitude. By afternoon, the wind howled harder, rattling the shutters. Iyana bent to mend her own dress, the tear still raw from the post. Her hand shook, thread slipping through the cloth. Beckett watched in silence. Then he rose, picked up his own spool of thread, and said quietly, "Give it here." She froze, clutching the fabric at her chest. Fear pricked, sharp and familiar. But when she saw only needle and thread in his hand, his calm eyes steady, she slowly let go. He knelt by the fire, big hands working with surprising care. Each stitch was sure, rough fingers guiding the needle as though the task mattered. When he finished, he nodded once and handed it back. Their fingers brushed in passing, a brief warmth that made her heart stumble. She pressed the cloth to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Beckett only gave a small nod and went back to tend the fire. In the glow, the space between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge. Night fell hard, snow piled deep, wind hammering the cabin walls. Beckett checked the bar on the door, then settled by the hearth. Iyana spread her blanket near the flames. The air carried warmth now, not just from firewood, but from something unspoken. The storm outside screamed, but inside, the soft sounds of thread pulling through cloth and the crackle of fire soothed her nerves. After a long silence, her voice came soft. "Uncertain, this place. It isn't like anywhere I've known." She paused, swallowing. "Here, I feel like I exist." Her words trailed off, frightened she'd said too much. Beckett laid a hand on the rifle resting by his chair, eyes on the door. "So long as I'm here, no one touches you." The words were simple, but iron. She turned back to the fire, eyes stinging. Not despair this time, but relief. For the first time, her tears carried hope. That night, the storm raged on, snow piling high. Yet in the cabin, they sat across the flames, silence no longer heavy, but shared. Beckett set his rifle aside, close but not clenched, while Iyana finished her sewing. When his hand moved once to steady her stitches, she didn't flinch. And when she lay down near the fire, sleep came easy. No whips in her dreams, no ropes at her wrists, only warmth. Only the memory of a man who had bent over the fire to mend her dress. Outside, the snowstorm swallowed the valley. Inside, the little cabin no longer felt like a shelter of necessity. It had begun to feel like home, a place where hope, fragile and new, was taking root. The snow was slow to melt on the ridges, leaving a thin glass of ice shining in the pale sun. That morning, Beckett stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the trail into the valley. He knew Silver Briar's silence wouldn't last. The town never forgot those who defied its order. Inside, Iyana gathered wood by the stove, stealing glances at his straight figure against the white. Her chest tightened with worry, yet beneath the fear was a new certainty he would not abandon her, nor bow to Malloy's whip or Sheriff Kincaid's decree. By noon, hoofbeats rolled into the valley. 3 riders broke from the tree line, Deputy Ward Ellison at their head. The tin star on his chest glinted sharp, his face set hard with the weight of law. 2 men flanked him, hands near their guns, eyes full of hate. They stopped short of the porch. Ellison pulled his reins tight and called out, voice loud enough to cut through the wind. "Lane, this is the last time. Sheriff Kincaid orders you hand over the girl, and this ends here." The air turned heavy. Beckett stepped onto the porch, Henry rifle loose in his hands, but his stare like stone. He spoke slow, words carved deep into the cold. "She's here, with me. One of the riders spat, hand twitching toward his holster. Then the cabin door creaked. Iyana stepped out, trembling but upright, her dark eyes locked on them, her voice breaking but clear. "I stole bread, because I was hungry. That's all." Silence hit the valley like a hammer. The truth, plain and raw, cut sharper than any blade. Deputy Ellison's jaw clenched. He looked at Beckett, then at Iyana, not the cowering girl tied to a post, but someone who stood and spoke for herself. The riders shifted in their saddles, uncertainty creeping in. One muttered, "Ain't worth blood over a loaf." The other scowled, but his hand fell away from the gun. The tension cracked, like ice under sun. Ellison drew a breath, his voice lower now. "The sheriff won't ride out again. As long as she stays clear of Silver Briar, we'll call it done. Beckett's rifle never wavered. She won't set foot in your town. That's enough." The moment stretched, long as winter. Then Ellison jerked his reins. The three turned their horses, hoofbeats fading until the valley was still again. Iyana shook, but not with fear. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at Beckett. He lowered the rifle, came to her side, and said quietly, like a vow, "It's over. They won't be back." Her breath shuddered out, the weight she'd carried breaking loose at last. On the porch, under the fading light. Beckett laid a rough hand on her shoulder. It was more than protection. It was a promise. They stood there together, watching the empty trail. The storm had passed, and with it, the greatest threat had receded. For the first time, relief spread through her chest, warm as the fire inside the cabin. That night, they sat by the hearth. Iyana cupped a bowl of hot stew, her hand still trembling, but a faint smile touched her lips. Beckett added another log to the fire, the glow rising high. Neither spoke much, yet both knew the darkness had been turned away. And in its place, something steadier had taken root, fragile. Yes, but strong enough to hold. The snow was thinning, giving way to dark earth and faint blades of grass pushing through on the hillsides. The long winter had passed, leaving the valley heavy with the damp smell of ground preparing for new life. In the small cabin, Beckett pulled on his worn boots, then glanced at Iyana by the fire. She was no longer the trembling girl bound at the post in Silver Briar. Her back was straighter, her eyes less haunted, and every motion carried a quiet steadiness that hadn't been there before. One morning, Beckett cinched his saddle and said, "We need to ride into town." Iyana paused. The name Silver Briar still sent a shiver through her. But she remembered the day she had stood on the porch, speaking plain before them all. "I stole bread because I was hungry." That truth had broken something loose inside her. With Beckett at her side now, she no longer saw the town as only a place of shame. The road down was patchy with ice, sunlight flashing off the thaw. When Beckett reined up before Halper and company, eyes turned, but there was less venom than before. Some whispered, some looked away. Halper himself frowned, but said nothing. Beckett tied his horse and laid a steady hand at Iyana's back, helping her down. Inside. The shop smelled of wood and coffee. Beckett stepped to the counter, dropped silver coins, and spoke plain. A new coat for her. And boots fit for mountain ground. His voice carried no plea, only certainty. Halper hesitated, then brought out a heavy wool coat and a pair of sturdy boots. Beckett nodded. "Try them." The boots fit snug, not loose, not biting her ankles raw as before. When Iyana stamped her feet and looked up, Beckett's rare smile touched his face. "They'll do." That smile warmed her deeper than the coat ever could. For the first time, she felt not just sheltered, but seen. Those inside the store watched in silence. No curses, no jeers. Perhaps they understood. Or perhaps it was the weight of Beckett's stare that kept words in their throats. When they left, Iyana held the coat close, not just against the cold, but against the feeling rising inside her she was no longer the hungry thief, but someone worth standing beside. Back at the cabin. The afternoon moved gentle. Beckett patched a shutter, while Iyana laid out the small bundle of supplies neatly on the table. The room felt different now, less like a shelter borrowed against winter, more like a home being built. That night the fire burned high. Iyana worked her needle at the table while Beckett cleaned his rifle. At last he lifted his eyes, his voice low. "Rough Iyana, if you want to go, I won't hold you. But if you stay—" He paused, the weight of years of solitude pressing down. "Then this is our home." The needle slipped from her hand. She stared at him, heart pounding. All the years of being cast aside, all the nights of hunger and fear seemed to fall away. Slowly, she set her hand on the table, reaching toward him. Beckett's calloused hand came across, closing over hers. No more words were needed. The distance between them was gone. That evening they sat together, silent but sure. The trust forged in hardship had become the foundation of something lasting. Friends, if you've listened this far, you know the true heart of this tale. A girl once bound and shamed, now standing in new boots and a warm coat, symbols not of charity, but of dignity. A man once hardened by loss, now willing to say, "This is our home. This is what rebirth looks like on the frontier." If you believe Beckett was right to stand for Iyana, let us know in the comments. Share a word of support for them both, and tell us should they remain in the quiet safety of the cabin, or take the harder road and claim a place inside Silver Briar itself. Your voice can guide where their journey goes next, because this story, at its heart, asks us, once a home is found, once peace has been earned, will they be brave enough to protect it against the turning tides of the West? One thing is certain, that little cabin in the valley is no longer empty. It has become the beginning of a new life, peaceful, hopeful, and worth fighting for.